Folks, let's get started, please. Thank you very much. It's an absolute delight to see you all here. I can't tell you what a joy it is after 18 months of work on the part of many people. And it's all coming together at this moment. So we're all thrilled, and you're all immensely welcome. We've got 275 registrations from around the world, which I think compares quite well with the previous two conferences in Auckland. So I think it's just a sign that this field of conservation is growing and getting better all the time. And it's a particular joy to see people here, not only from the Antipodes, where, of course, a lot of this work originated, but now increasingly in North America, Mexico, Europe, places where people have had difficulty getting to the previous conferences, but a little easier to get to Dundee. The formal opening of this meeting will begin in about an hour at 12 o'clock. Her Royal Highness, the Princess Royal, is coming, as you know, and she wasn't able to get here at what we hope would be the beginning of the session. So what we're going to do, unusually today, uniquely today, is to divide this opening session effectively into three bits. We've got three short talks, standard talks, which will happen shortly. Then there will be the formal opening for about 20 minutes or so. And then Bisbell will give the first keynote lecture of the meeting. And we're expecting to finish by no later than 1 o'clock. A little bit depends on when Her Royal Highness can arrive, but normally she's very punctual, so we expect to be able to get on to the formal opening at the appointed time. I just want to show you a graph, just to show how you lot like to cut things fine. This is the graph of registrations for this conference. I haven't actually got the beginning of when we announced it. It's way over here to the left. And what you'll see is that just 4 months before the end of the early bird, when Alison and I and the trustees were getting a little nervous, we still had only 10% of the people who are here today registered. And it made me realize that those who are brave enough to take on a conference like this have to have balls of steel, because you don't know when to pull the plug and say no one's interested. But I'm delighted to say that as the deadline for the early bird registration approached, then people began to think, I better do something. And we had a great flurry in the last few days. And of course, we had some after the deadline as well. People said, oh, please, please, please. Can we register at the cheaper rate? Anyway, you're all here now, and that's fantastic. And we had the last registration just 2 days ago. So there may yet be more people coming to the meeting. So I've explained the format of this session. The one thing I must say to you is, and this is especially true for the days when we've got parallel sessions, I will have to ask you to be very good on your timekeeping. We're going to have 2 sessions going on at the same time on Tuesday and Thursday in this lecture theatre and the one below. There will be some people who want to go between one talk and another in different lecture theatres. And the only way that can happen without causing a great deal of disruption is if people finish their talks on time, and there is then 3 minutes for people to get to the other lecture theatre. So we've got a group of, I think it's 18 excellent and brutal chairs who will cut you off at the knees if you go beyond your 12 minutes. And the 12 minutes out of your 15-minute slots will include questions. So if you are one of the rare people who finish in less than 10, 11, 12 minutes, then the chairs have the opportunity to ask for questions. If you go on to 12 minutes, which is when the light turns red, then you will be, yes, it's this kind of blood-curdling red. And then you will be hauled mercilessly off the dais to allow time for the chair to introduce the next speaker and for the next speaker to come and start. So the 15-minute slots are from the start of one talk to the start of another. I've got just a few other things to tell you about, and then Alison is going to give you some housekeeping notes so that you're all aware of what's going on. PowerPoint files. I think we've now got the vast majority of files either sent in electronically or handed in on sticks this morning. Thank you very much for that. Those of you who have not yet done so, please do so as soon as possible. Otherwise, my blood pressure goes up, and then I get concerned we're going to have gaps in the... I don't know if anyone's going to be a no-show until they give us their talk. Posters. A number of people asking about posters. There will be... The main poster session is tomorrow evening, Tuesday. The poster boards will be set up by lunchtime. So we would ask you, please, to go into the poster room at lunchtime, if you possibly can. The space allocated for your poster will be on a poster board there. If it's not, please come and find me or one of the volunteers, and we will find space for you. You should be in abstract number, numerical order. At the moment, I'm unsure whether we're going to need an overflow room for the posters. If there are a few no-shows, we can probably stay in one room, but we have the opportunity to go into two if need be. Changes to the program. The program, which I hope you've all got, with the sort of caramel-coloured cover, was printed 2 weeks ago. And there have been a few changes to the program, mostly people who've withdrawn talks, and I have got a substitute there. We will post every day on a board downstairs the changes to the program for that day. So when you come in, please check on that, and you'll see where the changes are. Up to now, I think we're looking at 4 or 5 changes, something like that. And the Wednesday morning RSPB workshop has been cancelled. The last thing I'm going to say here is that I'm going to start the session 5 minutes early in this room at 5 minutes to 9, simply so that I can update you on any changes for the day. So although the talks will start promptly at 9 o'clock, please come in here at 5 to 9 if you possibly can, and allow me to tell you what's going on for the rest of the day. And just one final thing. Because Her Royal Highness is coming in this morning, there are certain protocols that we have to adopt, and I would just ask you to stay seated. When she comes in, you'll see Philippa Foster-Back, our chair, will bring Her Royal Highness into the room, and then there will be 3 talks, Professor Pete Downs, and then Philippa, and then Her Royal Highness. And then I will take over again, and we will do the keynote talk. Then stay seated to allow Her Royal Highness to leave, and then once she's out of the way, I'll give you a nod, and we can all go and grab lunch. Alison, where's Alison?
Okay, so I think most of you have got the lie of the land already. Just to let you know, firstly about Wi-Fi, you've got instructions for that in your conference bags. Have a look in. You'll find that the Wi-Fi in the lecture theatres is not too great. That's intentional, so the students of Dundee University don't spend the entire lecture on their phones. In terms of the fire, there won't be a fire drill. If the alarm does go off, leave by the nearest exit, and remember that in this lecture theatre there's also an exit up the back. Just go downstairs and to the rear of the building, okay? There are toilets on both corridors. The corridor directly to the right of this lecture theatre is off limits because of HRH until later on today. And can I just remind everyone who's meeting Her Royal Highness in the first 3 rows to be downstairs, please, in the foyer for 11:30. And if we can keep those seats clear, please, because we will be coming back up and using them again. Okay, thank you very much.
So it gives me the greatest pleasure to introduce our first speaker today, Dr. Brooke from Cambridge University. I've known Mike for many, many years. He's a dear friend and takes ribbing very well. And he's giving us a talk this morning, Rat Eradication in the Pitcairn Islands, South Pacific, a 25-year perspective. Thanks, Mike.
Great, thanks, Tony. It's a huge honour to be opening this conference and not a little humbling to be in the presence of some of the people who've most advanced our understanding of island invasives and also of the practitioners whose arrival at an island will cause rats to retreat into their burrows and who will cause cats to raise their fur in fear. And what I'm going to be doing this morning is talking about work in the Pitcairn Islands that has, in a sense, stretched over 25 years. And during those 25 years, I've spent about 2 years of my life on the Pitcairn Islands. And the islands in question are the single inhabited island of Pitcairn, and then the two atolls to left and right of Oino and Ducie, and finally Henderson, the World Heritage Site. And the story really starts with Henderson, the World Heritage Site, which was designated in 1988. And at that time it was realised that the island wasn't especially well known. And so a few years after that, a group of us really set up a large expedition that attempted to document Henderson from head to toe. So there were archaeologists, geologists, and biologists of various persuasions. And one of the key findings of the expedition was the very low breeding success of the surface nesting gadfly petrels. People will know that these species would typically have a breeding success of 60–70%, and as you can see, the number was much lower, and that was particularly concerning for the Henderson petrel endemic to the island. And the problem seemed to arise not because the species had any difficulty in hatching their eggs, they didn't. The problem arose when the chick hatched, and within a day or two of hatching, the Pacific rats introduced to Henderson by the Polynesians would move in, grab the chick from beside the parent, and the parent showed feeble defensive abilities, and then the rat would eat the chicks, and that caused a very low breeding success. So when these findings entered the public domain in the mid-90s, the late Brian Bell contacted myself and others and proposed rat eradication. And first off, the eradication was to be undertaken on Oino and Ducie, the low atolls. And this was actually relatively straightforward. These have an area of 60–80 hectares, and ground baiting would do the trick. And those projects were successful, and since that time we've been able to document an increase in the population of the most tractable petrel species, Murphy's petrel, on Oino. But also at the time, the project included not only Oino and Ducie, but also the single inhabited island, about 5 square kilometres in extent, of Pitcairn. And as you can see from the left-hand picture, the topography of the island is rugged, to put it mildly, and of course there are the complications associated with the people who live on the island, the Pitcairners themselves. And in fact, there were 2 attempts, the first in 97 and the second in 98. And the project in 97 at least suffered from a lack of prior reconnaissance by expert people. So I think it's fair to say that when the rat eradication team arrived and saw the topography, they said, gosh, or words to that effect. But nonetheless, they heroically cut a grid of paths for laying the bait, and then perhaps another mistake was made, that the follow-up monitoring by the expert people was limited. It was entrusted to the Pitcairners, who of course don't have expertise, have their own day-to-day concerns, couldn't devote the necessary time to it. And another factor that influenced the sequence of events, I think, was that the most likely source of money for the project was the UK government's Department for International Development, whose prime interest was, of course, the inhabited island of Pitcairn. So that meant that the doable, the tractable projects of OENO and DUSI were associated with perhaps the much more troublesome project on Pitcairn. It was, in a sense, the source of money that drove the project that emerged. And at this time, so we're talking 20-odd years ago, Henderson was undoable. But then, of course, our knowledge developed, and by the mid-noughties, sort of 2005 or thereabouts, the largest island, Henderson, started to come within people's radar. So it was always envisaged that the Henderson operation would involve a ship coming, as it turned out, from California. It would involve helicopter drop of bait. It would involve a couple of bait drops. And it would probably be done in August, September, because that's where phenology studies during the Sir Peter Scott expedition had indicated that fruitability was at its lowest. Not negligible, but at its lowest. But the feasibility report that David Towns and I produced highlighted two issues that needed further attention before a green light was given. And the first was associated with the crabs. These are land-dwelling hermit crabs that live at very high densities behind Henderson's beaches. So the question was really, how much bait do those crabs eat? They can eat the bait containing Brodifacoum without damage to themselves. And how much extra do you have to put on the ground effectively to feed the crabs first, leaving enough bait over for the rats? And this was tested by fieldwork in 2009 by putting out dyed bait where crabs are most common. And the hope is that you can demonstrate that you put out enough bait to ensure that the crabs are fed and that they're sufficient such that every rat has evidence from the dye of having taken in bait. So that might be dyed whiskers, dyed anus, and so forth. And we were able to tick that box. And then the other issue highlighted as a potential problem by the feasibility report was the issue of the flightless rails. We know from previous projects that rails are susceptible to bait, and clearly it would be catastrophic to wipe out an endemic flightless rail in the course of eradicating the rats. So we had to demonstrate that we could keep a batch of rails, a long stock population if you like, in captivity whilst bait was available. And again, we were able to tick that box. So at that point, we had positive results. Eradication was looking feasible, approval was obtained, and the RSPB led the search for the £1.5 million that the operation was going to need. And then, really before the big boys arrived with the boat and the helicopters, the smaller boys had to set about catching rails to be kept in captivity, and that by and large went fairly well, not perfectly, because there were some unexpected hiccups, and the number we had in captivity before the boat arrived was 85, a little under the target of 100, but not so far below target that cancellation was necessary. And this was the converted Alaskan crab boat, the Aquila, that arrived at Henderson on a rather dreary day in the middle of August. And then the baiting proceeded with the helicopter distribution of bait, flying GPS tracks. And our technique for protecting the very, very valuable rails in their cages was simply to put a plastic sheet over their cages when the helicopter was flying overhead and broadcasting death to the ground below. And that also worked very well. The pellets just bounced off the plastic sheeting. And this operation took place in August 2011, and all was looking good up to the time that the people looking after the rails left in November, so 3 months after the bait drop. But then catastrophe, a person from a National Geographic group came ashore in March 2012 and saw and indeed obtained visual evidence of rat presence. And that presence was confirmed about a couple of months later. And since then, we've done genetic studies that suggest there were around 80 surviving rats out of a population of 80 to 100,000. So ballpark, 1 in 1,000 survived. So what went wrong? We were pretty confident it wasn't a reintroduction, and indeed our knowledge of boat traffic made that highly unlikely, and the genetic data confirmed as much. The helicopter data provided no evidence of gaps in coverage, no evidence of poor bait quality. And in 2013, it was possible to test well, not the survivors, but it would be maybe the great-grandchildren of survivors, no evidence of resistance to the poison brodifacoum. So it seems that a handful of rats simply preferred natural food to bait pellets. And that was confirmed by choice tests in 2013 and 2015. And a special problem seems to have been coconuts, which the rats prefer to bait. And particularly worrying is some surprise coconuts in the middle of the island that nobody knew about in advance. So we can think of various adjustments. We might adjust the timing, but there's no real evidence that this would help. We could think of doing some selection to make rats less fussy, but I don't think that's practical. We could consider how to reduce or eliminate the availability of coconuts. We could lengthen the baiting period. We could perhaps, and this is what I would particularly advocate, developing more attractive bait. But I think we can be patient. Henderson hasn't changed very much in the time I've known it, and so it'd be foolish to proceed just because money became available. Rather be patient until we can demonstrate that a second attempt would have a greater chance of success. So my message very much is that Henderson will survive until any second attempt, which I hope will happen, but it can be delayed, and I'm being flashed a red light, so thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mike. Now is the time for the select few to leave, if you would. You all right, Piers? Are you okay? Okay, folks, it's time for the second talk, please. Thank you very much. Second speaker this morning is Jaclyn Pearson from the RSPB, and the title of her talk is Scaling Up on Inhabited Islands, Securing the Seabird Heritage of the Isles of Scilly. Thanks, Jaclyn.
There we go. Lovely, thank you, thanks. Hello everybody, so yes, my name is Jaclyn Pearson and I am the project manager for the Isles of Scilly Seabird Recovery Project. We are the largest community-based rat removal project that's been successful in the world to date, and behind me are the wonderful community of St Agnes and Gew. So our logo is at the top, the Isles of Scilly Seabird Recovery Project, and these are our partners. We are the lead, RSPB, Isles of Scilly Wildlife Trust, AOMB, Natural England, Duchy of Cornwall, and funding from Life and HLF. So where are we? Well, here we go, map of the UK. We're right down here. It was quite a long journey to get up here. You can see we're just 28 miles off the tip of Cornwall. And when we zoom in closer on that map, you're going to see 5 inhabited islands, Briar, Tresco, St Martin, St Mary's. And look in this box on the lower side here, that is St Agnes and Gew, where the project is based. We'll come to back to that map shortly. These are our 2 key species, removing the rats to protect the manx shearwaters and the storm petrels. Now, there was about 10 years of preparation to get to the point of the project beginning. We have a seabird liaison group on the islands, and that's the partners I discussed earlier. And what they realised as part of the strategies was that of the 20,000 breeding birds that we have, of 13 species, we were seeing a decline of around 25% between the years up to 2006. And one of the key outcomes for the manx shearwaters and storm petrels would be their survival by the removal of rats. So, looking back at this map, what you'll also see is when you look in this box here, I've got a very important island highlighted called Annet. That's in the Western Isles. That's the most important island for seabirds on the archipelago. And if we can protect that island from not having rats on St Agnes and Gew, that's great, but also open up the habitat by removing them from St Agnes and Gew. You look at the arrow, that denotes the nearest swimming distance to St Mary's, 1.2 kilometres, but that is a fast, cold, deep channel. So our challenges were always going to be the biosecurity on boats of the rats returning. Here's a nice aerial picture, and what this denotes is the fact there is a sandbar that connects St Agnes and Gew. So you've got to be careful, you've got to know your tide times when you're heading over to Gew. 2 people live there, and in total there's 84 people on these islands. That is what we class as the community, 84 people. Now, when it comes to inhabitants, that obviously brings different challenges, like waste and food, and the fact that we need to access their land. So in 2009, on the main island of St Mary's, we had a workshop. The Seabird Liaison Group had a workshop where they gathered the views of the people on the islands to say, would you think this could happen? Is it feasible? And this set the mandate to bringing over Biz Bell from Wildlife Management International. Do you remember this conversation, Biz? Yep, good one. The dog had a lot to say. So it's actually quite profound because one of the biggest concerns of the community was the non-target species. There were 4 dogs, 24 cats, so very important aspect. And what Biz did is she sat down with every household. She talked about the technical requirements of the project and what that meant to them, what their personal role would be, but also setting the vision. To remove the rats, yes, to keep it rat-free, and what that would mean for future years to come, so setting that legacy. And they could each talk to Biz. She also set out what the challenges would be, very open and honest, so they could talk and ask questions about what that might mean for them. And what we found is 100% of the community did value seabirds and would like the removal of rats. But it's not just the seabirds when it comes to people. It's obviously the socio-economics as well. On the left-hand side here, we have a picture of the campsite at Troytown. Rats were affecting that business, chewing through the tents, farmers' livestock and crops, the fishermen's lobster pots. We worked out that it was costing the islanders about £15,000 a year in bait and damage. That adds up over time. So 76% were saying they were coming into their homes. They didn't want rats in their homes, so there were other reasons. What they did is set out some stipulations for a project. They wanted a uniform, hence the bright orange hat you are going to see in every picture, which now haunts me for the days since Biz left the islands. They also wanted to have good communication, including with the school. So straight away we went over and gave them show and tell about the bait and health and safety. And of course, how does it work? So these are the bait containers, and we're thinking about the non-target species, preventing shrews, rabbits, birds, and also the pets. So the lockable bait station in everybody's home to stop children and pets. We then had an interim phase. We set up a comms group. We've now got between 2000 and 2013 in the January the project began. We need to find the funding, set up the interim work, which was a website with frequently asked questions. A steering group was set up. And on this slide here is Councillor Richard McCarthy, right above me here. Here's a St Agnes community member. It was important to have them on the steering group because this was to be a community-based project. And Paul St Pierre, who's now the project supervisor, he sought the external funding and we carried on education work. We tried to get ahead of the curve. We went back to St Agnes and carried on. Let's look at the footprints of rats and shrews. If this project's going to happen, let's try and keep ahead of that curve. Then we began. So, with a robust tender process, WMIL became our contractors for rat removal. Spalding's Associates did our wider ecological monitoring for other species. And then we started our rat-free, or rat removal ready, that should say, actions. Getting rid of as much harbourage and food before we start eradication as possible. This was a busy time. Beach cleans. Apple Day. This won a Life Award for the best photo. Isn't it lovely? The kids still do this now. Pick up windfall apples, turn them into apple juice. Don't give them to rats. Biosecurity on boats. So understanding the protocols, trying to reduce the high risk freight from the rats and putting bait on board. And also talking to community members about how we can access their properties, what that would mean on a weekly basis. Bin-friendly days. Most residents got a rat-proof bin or composter. I think the biggest part that Biz and her team were involved in, I think I only helped with one of the sheds, was the sorting out of people's sheds. This is quite a typical Solonian shed. And I didn't put it on the PowerPoint because I didn't want to upset the gentleman, but he does have a poster on his shed that says, "Don't touch everything in use." Really? And then baiting began. So 8th of November 2013, every day we'd record the bait take, we'd put it into a GIS list database, thank you Kelvin, and we'd record what take happened out of 1,000 monitoring stations, 50-metre wide grid. So here we go, 9th of November. Dark red spots, more than 6 blocks, and then as the colour gets lighter, it goes to a white spot, which is 1 block of bait. So 10th of November, 11th, 12th, 13th. Okay, we're starting to see some good results here. Fewer dots, fewer rats taking the bait. 17th, 18th of November, 19th, 20th, 22nd, little bit of action on GU, and there we go, last rat sign. Look at that, 30th of November. That is quick. We didn't know it would be this quick. We kept going. We keep baiting, we keep monitoring, we go till March until we're secure and feel that that was the last rat. Indeed it was. It was deemed as a very successful operation. So we've now got a 2-year interim period before Biz comes back for a 6-week check to deem us rat-free under international protocol. We train community members to check biosecurity stations around the coastline, of which we've got 100. So chocolate wax is now in those boxes instead of bait. 12 community members, and we set up this, rat on a rat. We call it a RAW. So anybody who comes to the islands, and we get many visitors, many day trippers, if they see something suspiciously ratty, call that number and we come and investigate. We had 28 rat on a rat calls. We set out grids to inspect the area, and then we deemed no rat sign from any of them, and now we'll just revert back with the community to checking those coastal and hotspot stations. And of course, monitoring the key species. Now, I know this isn't a great picture, but it's the first picture of the first Macleod water chick in living memory before I drop my phone with excitement. Oh my gosh, this has worked. And within 2 years, storm petrels returned. It works. And the silly shrew increased. This is endemic. We love the shrew, the community. We're very happy. And then Biz returned. 2-year check. We were deemed rat-free. We had a lovely celebration with the community. This is their reward. And we did questionnaires, semi-structured, with each of the community members to evaluate the project. Regards delivery, they couldn't see reasons how we'd improve. And the main thing is they felt listened to. At any time, if there were any questions, she would ask the contractors and the team, and we'd be able to adapt and constantly review those operations. That was important. When it came to the species, they knew that it had benefited the key species, but also they feel there's been no negative impact on non-target species. And then we get to those socioeconomics. When we asked what's the most important thing about the project, the thing you enjoyed the most, I thought it would be no rats or more seabirds. It was actually having the team on the islands. How lovely is that? So in the winter time, they just enjoyed having us there, learning about the SEABIRD project and having a happy group of people willing to work with them at all times. And then when it came to the economy, they feel 100% of the community feel it's benefited. If not already, it will do. It's eco-tourism on the Isles of Scilly. Obviously, biz use local providers like here at the shop, getting our bread. But also, we asked people, have you had any new products since the project? This is Mike Hicks. These were his apples on Apple Day. Since Apple Day, he now has an apple juice company and he's moved to cider. I have nominated myself to be chief taster. And this here is St Agnes Boating. They say a 200% increase in visitors on board boats because they can talk about the project, they've gained interpretation skills, they've got a story to tell. That is impressive. Also, we've had quite a bit of media coverage on the BBC, Countryfile, Springwatch, and that's had quite a big knock-on effect of people knowing about the project. So now, long-term monitoring phase, I have 32 what are called SHVs, rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? SEABIRD Heritage Volunteers. They check the permanent monitoring stations every month. If there's a rat on a rat call, they help carry out surveillance. If there's ever an incursion response, they will swap that wax for bait, and then a team from the RSPB will come on over so that they can help us put the bait out. And also, they'll keep monitoring the shearwaters. In conclusion, everybody, I feel 3 factors are important in this, and it was being community-based, right from the start, understanding the vision, it was preparation is key, and thirdly, it was about the project is owned by the community. They are very proud to take it forward. Thank you very much.
You are so on time. I think we could even afford a question.
What about the next islands?
Yeah, we are looking at funding opportunities. We'd love to do them, and they'd have to be done together because the swimming distance is a lot shorter than from St Agnes and Gew to St Mary's, so it'd have to be done in one area. So far, feedback from this community has said go for it on the other islands, but we'll start that process. So funding, please, if you've got any, bring it our way.
Right, Jaclyn,
Thank
thank you
you.
very much indeed. So our third standard talk this morning is by Iain Macleod from Scottish Natural Heritage. And Iain is talking on a subject which I'm beginning to learn something about. That is the eradication of mink in the UK. This is a big problem, but one that the UK community is beginning to get on top of. And Iain's talk is large-scale eradication of American mink from the Outer Hebrides of Scotland. I know some of you have already been out there. Thanks, Iain.
Thank you. Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Iain Macleod. I'm manager of the Hebridean Mink Project, employed by Scottish Natural Heritage, which is the Scottish Government's nature conservation agency. I've been working for the project since 2001, but involved in the earliest discussions on eradication since 1987. So it's been a long time coming, the end of this project, but I hope you appreciate the scale of it. The Outer Hebrides, also known as the Western Isles, is situated off the west coast of Scotland. In geographical scale, the archipelago is large, an area of 305,000 hectares. Lewis and Harris is the third largest island in the UK, after the UK mainland and Ireland itself. The entire Outer Hebrides has approximately 2,500 kilometres of coastline. That's 15% of the entire coastline of Scotland. There's over 7,500 freshwater lochs, 24% of Scotland's total. The island is highly designated for flora, fauna, and geographical features, which makes the Outer Hebrides unique in terms of its biodiversity. And many of the ground nesting bird species on the island are highly vulnerable to the invasive American mink. they arrived in the 1960s due to the fur farming industry. In 2001, after many years of ineffective local control, the Hebridean mink project was initiated. That was done with the aid of EU life funding. It's important to realize that this project was viewed from the very beginning as experimental, innovative, and had significant challenges in reaching its goal of eradicating mink from the Uists, which at that time were viewed as being the most important area in terms of the density of ground nesting birds, especially ground nesting waders. In order to try and achieve that eradication of mink from the Uists, we chose to use live catch cage trapping, principally because it was seen as being the method that would have the fewest non-target species impacted in that control method. In addition, we had to secure the Uists from immigrating animals from further north, so we had to create a buffer zone in South Harris, the red area on the map. Phase 1 was deemed a success. Effective eradication was declared in 2006. And in 2007, phase 2 of the project was started, which was when I became manager of the project. This project was funded by SNH, Esme Fairbairn, the local authority, and Highlands and Islands Enterprise. We had learnt some significant lessons from our first phase of the project. Not least of these was how to actually distribute traps on the ground. And what we needed to do was pre-position all our traps in a GIS system. And we needed to do those on linear features of riparian and coastal edge. In doing that, we chose intersections of those linear features, and we started the process by placing dots on the map. And it soon became apparent that the scale of this operation was quite intimidating. In the end, we had 7,553 live catch cage traps to put out. And to put it in context, it also meant that the trappers had serious mileage to walk between traps on an individual route. But in placing those traps, they had a leeway of 50 meters, so that not only were we directing the trap distribution as a desktop exercise, but the trappers themselves could pick the very best locations for those traps in the field. We also had to have really robust data management backing up the information coming back from us on the GPS units, because different trappers would move traps around, choose different locations, and so we had to actually make sure that all the data capture was robust. Systematic trapping from south to north through the island, sequentially doing sections of the island in series, eventually removed 95% of the population by 2013. Now, it didn't take me very long to say that, but the effort involved in getting that done was considerable. Phase 2 of the project had already moved into an extension period by this point and was being funded solely by Scottish Natural Heritage. So there was significant financial pressure on the project at this stage and a reducing workforce. So we had to target areas rather than just continue with the same old sequential trapping on the ground. In order to do that, we required a system in which we could detect the small number of animals left and remove them through a trapping effort. We did this in our monitoring system, which in itself was quite extensive and took significant time to maintain. It it's a huge geographical area, and it took trappers on occasions 2 hours just to get to the start of their day's work and 2 hours home. So the logistics of this project are something to bear in mind at all times. In total, we put in 17 devices per 10 square kilometers, which resulted in over 600 devices in total. These were a combination of clay footprint tunnels, carbon footprint tunnels, camera traps, MINK rafts, and wildlife capture cameras. So we carried on with that, but alongside it, we had a permanent structure of MINK police units, which accounted for a small but significant number of animals alongside the trapping efforts which we carried out on detection of an animal. As the team of trappers reduced from 12 to 6 to then just 3, it became impossible to maintain this system. It was just not feasible to carry out and maintain the monitoring and carry out a trapping campaign round a detection that was responded in a time frame which meant that the animal was still in that location, because by this point the few mink that were left were roaming around freely and over a large geographical area. The project had already made use of the newly developed automated trap, mink police, but we also had to make the decision at this time to move to kill traps, because the 3 trappers left couldn't visit enough traps in a day to make the trapping effort worthwhile. So we once again had to change our technique to have a kill trapping campaign. This is the current Magnum 116 kill trap and mink police distribution across the island, and it's based on our historical captures. So our current trapping campaign is based on the favoured habitats of the mink and where we have caught most animals. But not only that, it has to have an element of checking areas where only a few mink were caught. Otherwise, you could miss that lone, isolated, nomadic individual. Despite the kill trapping, moving to that technique, we have actually maintained our extremely low bycatch kill rate, which is less than 0.01%. So 1 in 10,000 animals is a non-target capture. So it's down to the skills of the trapping team that managed to maintain that very low level. In terms of what that looks like from the start of phase 2, this is a graph of captures with the red bars being female captures, the blue bars being male captures, and you can see the seasonality of that in terms of our capture rate. The green horizontal line is actually our trap effort. And you can see from the graph, oh, sorry, I pressed that too far. You can see from the graph that the absolute effort applied in the project has increased quite considerably, despite the fact that we've gone from 12 trappers down to 3. Last year, we caught only 7 animals. To date this year, we've caught only 4. Sorry. And of those, we have not caught a single juvenile since September 2015 in Lewis and Harris. So we believe there is no longer an effective breeding population of mink in Lewis and Harris. In fact, there may not be any mink left in Lewis and Harris at this time, but time will tell. We need to keep monitoring to ensure that that's the case. The actual captures per unit effort is even more dramatic, with a peak of 48 mink caught per 1,000 trap nights at the beginning, and that's dropped down to below a single mink per 10,000 trap nights now. Aberdeen University did a modelling exercise with us, which showed that this hierarchical statistical model showed that used the data from the live catch trapping, showed that 80% probability of achieving eradication by 2017. But that same model also had a very long tail in the graph, which actually is mirrored by what we saw in the previous graph, and gives you pause for thought that the end of these eradications can be a very long time coming. In addition, mink tolerate interbreeding really well. We did have a fly in the ointment, though, in that we had 2 sightings of mink in the US, and to cut a long story short, we caught 97 since 2014, but we've since only caught 9 animals this year. We're in control of that, and we believe that we're going to achieve eradication. In summary, we need support from the community, and we need skill-committed professional staff, especially at the tail end, adaptive management approach, but most importantly, long-term management support, organisational commitment, and funding for the long term. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And just before I introduce the first of those 7 keynote speakers, I just want to give a sort of personal note to say why I am so thrilled to see you all here. It is because, as the Princess Royal mentioned, the South Georgia Heritage Trust and the South Georgia Project, which I had the privilege of leading, benefited so much from that last meeting in 2010. The friendships I made there, the contacts I made there, have lasted the test of time, and the support that was provided over those 7 or 8 years by the people I met has been absolutely monumental. And I'm sure without it, the South Georgia Project would not have ended as happily as it did. I'm now delighted and proud to think of myself as part of this community. I certainly didn't at the time. And for me, this conference will be a success if it informs, inspires, and forges friendships and collaborations as the last one in the series did. And I'm sure all of us here will agree on that sentiment. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Elizabeth Biz Bell, a giant of the field. Biz, I'm sure, is known to everyone here. She's carved out a niche worldwide, especially for ground-based eradications. But the reason I thought that Biz would be a great first keynote speaker today is that she's the one who's led many of the UK-based eradications, including the Shants and the SCILLYs, about which we've heard already. So it's a great delight to see you here, Biz. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony, Your Highness, and everyone else. Yes, no, it's an absolute pleasure to be here, and especially to talk about ground-based operations before we start hearing about all of those really exciting aerial application programs. But before I start, I'd like to thank all of those project partners, various landowners, island owners, funding agencies, and everyone else who I've worked with. So when I talk about we in this talk, you know, because you're constantly talking, we've done this and we've done that, I'm talking about wildlife management and all of these people, all of these program partners. But even more importantly, when I talk about we, I'm talking about the amazing volunteers who have worked on all of these projects with me. And many of them are in this room, and many of them have gone on to bigger and better things. But the success of these projects is basically a credit to them and their hard work and enthusiasm throughout. So, as we all know, there's been a large number of black rat and brown rat eradications worldwide. And, you know, we started quite a long time ago. France, 1951. and then in New Zealand in 1959. Okay, these were actually unintentional and generally put out because lots of bait was put out to stop rats affecting seabird colonies. But once we found that we could accidentally do it, scientists and ecologists thought maybe we could actually do this on purpose. And so for the next sort of 20 years, New Zealand ecologists in particular played around with this idea, generally on the ground, looking at bait stations and hand broadcasting methods to get this bait out and about. And then in 1981, they actually did it on purpose and managed to clear a little group of islands in the Hauraki Gulf. And since this, more and more eradications using ground-based methods kept happening. But then, of course, once we realised we could do it on the ground, there was this vision to try and bring this a little better, a little bigger, a little faster, and use other methods to target bigger and better islands. And aerial application of rodenticides was developed. And of course, if you pardon the pun, after that, eradications really took off. And we did get to do some massive islands. But of course, it's not all about aerial operations. There have been a significant number of bait station operations in the past 65 years as well. And many of these have actually occurred on really big islands, you know, even up to 3,100 hectares in Langara in British Columbia. So it can be done. And the other thing is really important to remember is the fact that aerial application methods are not universally accepted around the world. And in many locations, it's actually against the law. And the other thing to think about is, particularly as we move on to islands with people, is that communities are not that happy about broadcasting bait from the air for a number of reasons. And one of those locations that is not allowed to apply bait from the air is, of course, the UK. And I'm only talking about the UK itself and not their overseas territories. So here in the UK, it started in 1968 with an eradication on Cardigan Island in Wales. So you guys weren't too far behind the 8 ball with the rest of us. And then between 1968 and 1998, 4 other ground-based eradications happened in the UK. In Inchgarve, hopefully I'm pronouncing that right, all the Scots will probably moan, Ilsa Craig, Handa, and Puffin Island in Wales. Now, all of these eradications were ground-based, but the rodenticide was applied in holes, in burrows, under vegetation and rocks, and not actually in bait stations. And during this period of time, there was quite an increasing amount of resistance for just putting bait on the surface. And it was increasingly important to have more robust types of eradication processes. And this is particularly important into regarding how much bait was being taken by rats, how much bait was accidentally being taken by non-target species, and also reducing the overall amount of rodenticide in the environment. So, of course, New Zealand had already developed a lot of these operational procedures and best practice methods, and this is both for ground-based, even though most of the New Zealand eradications had moved on to aerial applications, so they'd also done best practice protocols for aerial applications as well. So as such, wildlife management brought those best practice guidelines from New Zealand to the ground-based operations we've undertaken in the UK. So I'm going to focus on the 5 eradications that we've directed for a range of agencies. So we started in Ramsay Island. Oh, hang on. In 1999, Ramsay Island is managed by the RSPB. It's about 260 hectares, and it's got permanent wardens on. We then went to Lundy Island, and in 2002, again, this is jointly managed by a range of companies and agencies. It also has permanent staff and has a farm on the island and has up to 20,000 visitors a year. We then went on to the Isle of Canna up in Scotland, and this is 1,300 hectares. It's managed and owned by the National Trust for Scotland. It has a small resident community, most of whom work for the National Trust. We then, as we heard from Jaclyn, moved on to St Agnes and Goo, 148 hectares, part of the Duchy of Cornwall, 84 residents, 6 farms, church, and several restaurants, and of course the school. And then most recently, the Shantiles, 171 hectares, privately owned, made up of 3 islands, 2 of which are connected by a rocky causeway. So one of the most important aspects about eradications in the UK is the fact that, with the exception of the Shantiles, all of them have been inhabited to some level. And like Jaclyn said, with the St Agnes and Goo eradication being the largest community-led eradication to date. So with the fact that there's communities and residents present, it's critically important that they're involved with every step of the eradication right from the beginning. It's absolutely vital that they feel that they have complete ownership and direction and control of the project. So how did we do this? Well, Jaclyn stole my thunder. She's already told you what we did. We went and chatted to them all. And sometimes that meant a 5-minute conversation because they were completely on board and wanted to save Manx shearwaters and get storm petrels back. But other times it meant a couple of hours over several cups of tea and coffee, which I'm actually not allowed to drink, and talking about the entire project from start to finish, talking about the techniques we're going to use, what ways we'll stop things happening to their pet cats, and talking to them about how it's going to affect their farms and things like that. And it also gave them the opportunity to ask me as the operator direct questions about, is this going to affect me? What can I do to make it not affect me at all? And things like this. And as Jaclyn said, we had to have a little uniform. So we had the bright orange hats. They called us the Flaming Ratters, and they could see us for miles. It was particularly important that we could be identified. It gave them the chance to talk to any one of our team members at any stage. The other thing they really liked was the fact that we had an open door policy, that they could come in any time of the day or night with any concerns that they may have, and they'd get a response. And of course, there was opportunities for the community to involve themselves completely in the eradication. Again, Jaclyn stole my thunder with the wonderful picture of the community members maintaining their own bait stations in their houses. But the school children were critical. They became the eyes and ears of the project. They became the ambassadors. They told off a lot of visitors for touching bait stations when they were being nosy. They also dobbed each other in when they started playing sword fights with the bamboo canes marking the bait station locations. But it was that involvement of the school children that really helped engage the parents and the rest of the community, because they felt that we were listening to every person in that community, whether they were small or large. And that involvement with doing their bait stations meant that they could learn aspects of the eradication, and particularly how important the monitoring was. So, yes, New Zealand's a colony of Britain, but we're quite different. So bringing those techniques from New Zealand didn't work to 100%. And the first thing we did was brought the classic New Zealand bait station design using a piece of drainage tube. Short, small piece of tube that we tried on Lundy Island. Well, it worked fine until we met your crows. So the crows learnt to put their heads in and reach in and get the bait. So we had to adapt it and put a little bit of an extension on to mean that they couldn't reach the bait. However, it's not that simple for crows. Of course, they then learnt to pull out the short wires on the end, one bird standing on top to balance it, and the other bird pulling the wires out. So we decided we had to put an extra wire and extra long wires so the crows wouldn't pull them out. And that worked really well for Ramsay until we got to Lundy Island. And then the crows there learned that you could flick the lids off to get the bait anyway. So we had to invent the crow clip. And that was just another piece of wire with a twist in it to hold the lid in place. So this is now the standard bait station for a UK operation. 4 wires, one which halves the entrance size, extra long to make sure the crows can't pull it out, and an extra wire on top to make sure the crows can't take the lids off. And a label for them to read, yeah. And of course, bait stations are really important because they minimise those risks to non-target species. And as I said, some of those risks are minimised by the station itself because, of course, larger stock and mammals can't get into it and they can't get access to the bait straight away. And that's been really important for a number of the locations because, of course, these places have all got farms and various ranges of stock. Lundy has pretty much every animal you could possibly think of, from Sika deer to Soay sheep to Highland cattle to domestic stock. So you want to make sure that they have no access to the bait. But then, of course, it's also the grid size that helps reduce risk. Because, of course, to these little guys at the top, wood mice and shrews, we can't prevent them from getting access to the bait stations, but by limiting their small home ranges and having the grid size much larger means you may unfortunately affect a few individuals, but the population thrives after the eradication, as shown on Lundy, the Isle of Canna, and on the Scillies, where the shrew and wood mice numbers have exploded. And of course, there's a range of bait types and formulations available for a bait station operation. And bait blocks are brilliant because they're not only going to target your animal specifically, but they also can be used directly as a monitoring tool because you can clearly see rat teeth marks in the different types of blocks you use. So that's great. The other thing is we're involving the bait manufacturers themselves. We can have an open and frank discussion about what's working and not working at an eradication and any issues that come up. And on the Lundy operation, it was a bit wet a lot of the time, and the bait split and bloomed. So when we discussed this with the bait manufacturers, they've now moved on and changed their formulations, adding a little bit more wax content to make it last a little bit longer, so that benefits the manufacturer for their product, but it also benefits us in the next eradications in wet environments. And then, of course, when you come across specific issues in an eradication that we didn't really foresee, although Dick will be really pleased because it matches his results with Bittrex. On the Lundy operation, we used the bait containing Bittrex, which, of course, for those who don't know, it's a bittering agent to stop children eating bait, because, of course, they really look like lollies with these big skull and crossbones on top. But there is some evidence now that there may be some aversion to Bittrex. And on Lundy, this is what we found. In 3 locations, we had rats that were not eating the bait. Now, we tried all sorts of methods to get them to eat it. We chocolate dipped the bait. We painted lard on top of the bait. But basically, they chewed through the chocolate, they chewed through the lard, got to the rodenticide, and then stopped eating. So we chatted to the bait manufacturers, and they made us a special batch. Now, they didn't believe that Bittrex was actually going to be an issue, but they still made this little batch for us. So we got given 10 kilos of Bittrex-free rodenticide, a special batch, and those 3 rats scoffed it down. So there's a little bit of proof that Bittrex may be an issue in some situations. And of course, everybody assumes that bait station operations are really hard and masses of labour is required. And don't get me wrong, we used loads and loads of fit and healthy young volunteers. But it is amazing how easily it is to move around bait stations in large bulk bags, and the great competitive nature of volunteers is the fact that they really want to see that they can carry the most bait stations on their backpacks. And it's also assumed that on islands that have significant cliffs and are really, really steep are also impossible to do by bait stations. And I'm hoping I'm not stealing too much of Charlie's thunder, but as shown by both Canna and the Shans, as long as you have the right team and the specialist equipment, that's not a problem either. So once you've got these bait stations in position, we map them with GPSs. And we individually identify them with numbers. So you can produce amazingly detailed maps that tell you the position of every single bait station during your eradication. And then you can move forward and give the team specific information to help them throughout the operational procedure. And some of these maps, of course, give us that great opportunity to work together with stakeholders such as archaeologists and botanists to look out for really special sites of significance. One, this is the Canna. This is called the Nunnery. It's an archaeologically important site. And the archaeologists didn't want us to put any bait stations inside this area because it had never been surveyed and dug up, and they wanted to make sure that we didn't tamper with anything. Luckily for us, the distance from there to there was exactly 25 metres, which was what our grid was. So we didn't have to worry about that, but it was easily identifiable for them, and we could make sure that the team knew where it was. We also could mark safe access routes in and out of areas around the bait station grids. And, you know, we've been at the pub in the Isles of Scilly, sitting there in the Turk's Head in St Agnes, and the locals started telling us we're talking in codes. And this is because we all started talking about, wow, bait station ZA19, one of the cattle has squashed that one. So whoever's doing that tomorrow, make sure you go and take a new bait station. And we could intimately know exactly every 25 to 50 to 100 metres, depending on the species we're targeting, exactly where that person was talking about. And it meant that everybody on the team knew exactly every position of every bait station and could deal with things as and when it happened. And this individual information is critical when that data is then linked to bait take to that specific station. We can then monitor which one has got the most bait take, or if there's a strange event happening at that location. And that specific bait take can then lead to detailed heat maps which show bait take throughout the entire eradication. And the great thing about these heat maps can also tell you and highlight long-term risk management. It gives you that idea of, in biosecurity, that maybe this area or this area where the highest bait take has been is high risk, so therefore we might need to think about more biosecurity monitoring in those locations. Whoops. Whoop. And the other thing is, once all of this fancy GIS is put together, and luckily we've got a fancy GIS specialist to help us, it can monitor the decline of rats numbers throughout the operation. I was going to say, and it's not going to work for me. So this was going to be a lovely animated video of the bait declining through the time from bait round 1 to bait round 10 on the Chantiles, where the eradication was successful, or well, hopefully soon to be successful. And the interesting thing is bait take is that, like I said, first level of monitoring. And the benefit of having the team on the ground throughout the eradication means that you can do in-depth monitoring throughout the program, both starting with that bait take and then moving on to specific monitoring tools, such as flavoured waxes, different types, so peanut flavoured and chocolate flavoured, tracking tunnels, trail cameras, chew cards, chew sticks. And this monitoring and this level of monitoring can help detect survivors and help us identify hotspots or fussy rats that we have to target in a different way. And this long-term and intensive monitoring can also help us that when the eradication team leaves, they can be pretty damn confident that they have got that last rat before they go. And then, of course, this will please Iain, for that most important step in any eradication is that critical biosecurity placement. And comprehensive biosecurity plans are developed for all islands that have had eradications, particularly the ones that we've been involved with here in the UK. But the great thing about having the team there and having these biosecurity plans developed is that we can implement and test them before we leave. And now that we've got most of these eradications happening on inhabited islands in the UK, the presence of the community means that we can train them up, because of course biosecurity has to happen indefinitely. It's going to happen forever. So by the community taking ownership of that project means they want to make sure that their islands are maintained rat-free from now on. So what's the future for eradications in the UK? Well, it's pretty damn exciting. You know, like I said, we started by bringing the New Zealand techniques from our best practice and the Pacific Invasives Group and their best practice and toolkits.
But now the UK, recognising that each island and each country is different, have developed their own eradication's best practice toolkit. This is outstanding. Now this has, like I said, built on all these things, but it's the lessons that they've learnt while we've been doing these eradications in the UK and the other agencies that have been doing them that have helped develop this best practice toolkit. And the exciting thing is, with the fact that the UK is leading the way with invasives eradications on inhabited islands, they're pretty much ahead of the rest of us in the world. And of course, linking it back to New Zealand, you're all probably aware that we've got this little target of 2050 being predator-free. And, you know, rats are one of the 2 target species. And communities in New Zealand are leading the way. Sorry, this is a bit of a blurry map, but every red spot on this map is where a community group is managing and running their own predator-free neighbourhood with traps and bait station operations. And they're sharing that vision of getting New Zealand towards 2050. And Wellington, the capital city, is moving this forward. And Wildlife Management is really pleased to be working with the local government there and bringing this UK development and eradication methodology to upscale what we've been doing over here to this peninsula, which has 2,500 homes. So we're moving forward and we're taking what we've learned from here back home to New Zealand. So the future of eradications isn't all up in the air. It's actually going to be ground-based bait station operations on inhabited islands and mainland sites. I'm sorry, but the community does not want bait spread from the air. They want carefully controlled and professionally managed bait station operations. The lessons learnt in the UK and the development of specific protocols during our most recent operations really means that there's a great model for inhabited island rat eradications to be taken to the rest of the world. And I'd just like to leave the final words to my father, Brian, who was one of New Zealand's pioneers for island restoration work. He's always said this: eradications are difficult and expensive, but with the right team, 100% commitment, hard work, and complete support by all, we can achieve anything. And he's damn well right. You know, there's been some incredible things to date, and it's only going to get more exciting from now on. Thank you. Questions?
We've even got time for a couple of questions. Wasn't that a brilliant talk? Thank you so much.
Very impressive. Yeah, thank you. I was just wondering what you think the largest size island that you could get rats away from, eradicate rats from using ground-based techniques.
Repeat the question.
Yep. So the question was, you know, what was my thoughts on the largest island possible? Well, you actually can pretty much do anywhere you like if you've got enough money and enough people and enough time and energy. But Langara showed you could do 3,000 hectares. I wouldn't be surprised if you could easily go up to 5,000, 6,000 hectares. It does depend on your terrain, but yeah, anything's capable as long as you've got the, you know, possible as long as you've got the right team and fully committed funds and staff.
Even on these islands with cities, like I looked on the Hawaiian Islands and many of them were just, you know, about 1 million people.
Well, this is what 2050 is all about, basically, in New Zealand, is developing techniques that can be taken into urban centres, scaling up from small, predator-free fenced areas to urban areas to larger areas and things. And this is what is happening in New Zealand, basically, yeah, developing it into specifically urban centres. I mean, most of those centres on that map are in the city. Wellington City is an absolute gem of an example because there are dozens of suburbs within those areas that are all working to be predator-free. And in fact, Wellington is wanting to be the first predator-free capital city. So, and they're well on the way. So yeah, urban centres doesn't necessarily preclude eradication at all.
Any other questions? We have a mic here, I think. Do you want to take it up? Thank you.
Hi. Quick question. How do you get rid of all the dead bodies?
I should have said that. Everybody always asks, what happens to the bodies? Most of the rats die underground. In all of our eradications, we've had less than 10 rats found on the surface. Any rat we do find on the surface is collected and disposed of. Yeah.
One more question. Ollie.
Are you planning to target any more British islands?
Anybody wants any eradications done? Not a problem. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Biz. That
No
was
problems.
exceptional stuff. That concludes this session. If you would be kind enough just to keep your seats for a few more minutes, we'll then go for lunch.